the doorway to the impossible. A paradox begins not with chaos, but with curiosity. It starts as a question that resists closure, a problem that persists despite every effort to reason it away. When we try to contain it, it slips through the boundaries of logic, much like water escaping the hand that tries to hold it. Paradoxes arise wherever human understanding meets the limits of its own structure. They reveal that reasoning, while powerful, is not infinite. Beneath their apparent contradictions lies an invitation to reflect on the framework of thought itself. The term paradox comes from the Greek paradoxon, meaning contrary to expectation. It refers to statements or ideas that appear self-contradictory, but contain truth within their conflict. Ancient philosophers such as Zeno and Epimenides used paradoxes to test the assumptions of logic and language. In modern times, scientists and mathematicians continue this exploration, confronting paradoxes that emerge not from abstract speculation but from the behavior of reality itself. Quantum physics, for instance, demonstrates that particles can exist in multiple states at once, a condition that defies classical intuition. Paradoxes bridge philosophy and science because both disciplines encounter the same frontier, the point at which explanation becomes self-defeating. To understand a paradox is not to resolve it. Its value lies in its persistence. A paradox endures because it exposes the boundaries of thought, not because it invites immediate correction. When we confront one, we experience the tension between what can be reasoned and what can only be observed. This tension produces unease, yet it also produces insight. It reminds us that the structure of knowledge is not absolute. Logic itself depends on premises that cannot be fully justified, and when those premises are questioned, reason begins to fold inward. The paradox thus becomes a mirror through which thought sees itself thinking. At this threshold, where certainty collapses, something essential appears. Awareness becomes visible as the one constant that remains when explanation fails. The paradox does not destroy knowledge, it humbles it. It reveals that every act of understanding rests on mystery. To study paradox is therefore not an escape from truth, but a return to its foundation, the silent recognition that the limits of reason are the beginning of consciousness. The paradox of free will. The question of free will addresses one of the most enduring tensions in human thought, whether individuals truly possess the power to choose their actions or whether every decision is the inevitable result of prior conditions. When one reflects on an ordinary act, such as lifting a hand or forming a thought, it seems natural to assume control. Yet beneath this apparent freedom lies a sequence of influences extending far beyond awareness. Genetics, upbringing, cultural context, and even neural chemistry contribute to the moment at which a decision appears. The paradox arises when the experience of choice seems genuine, but the mechanisms that produce it appear determined. Philosophers have long debated this contradiction. The deterministic view holds that every event, including human action, is governed by causal laws. In this framework, the universe unfolds like a chain of linked events, each following necessarily from what came before. Free will, in such a system, becomes an illusion, an interpretation the mind constructs while observing the movement of causes it cannot perceive. The opposing view asserts that agency is real, that consciousness possesses the ability to intervene in this chain and initiate actions independent of prior determinants. Between these two positions lies compatibilism, the attempt to reconcile freedom with determinism by redefining free will as the capacity to act according to one's internal motivations, even if those motivations have external origins. Scientific inquiry adds further complexity. Neuroscientific experiments have shown that brain activity associated with decision-making can precede conscious awareness of a choice. This suggests that the experience of deciding may be a retrospective interpretation rather than an initiating cause. Yet the data remain open to interpretation, and the subjective sense of agency persists as one of the most fundamental features of human life. Even if the mechanisms are determined, the perception of freedom shapes behavior, ethics, and identity. The paradox of free will thus resides in the space between subjective experience and objective explanation. If every choice is predetermined, moral responsibility becomes difficult to justify. If choices are truly free, they must operate outside causal order, which defies scientific understanding. Neither option resolves comfortably. The paradox remains, reflecting the tension between knowledge and self-perception. In questioning whether our actions are chosen or inevitable, we confront not only the limits of causality, but also the structure of consciousness itself. The Ship of Theseus. The Ship of Theseus is one of the earliest recorded thought experiments concerning the nature of identity and change. It appears in the writings of Plutarch, who described a ship preserved in Athens as a tribute to the hero Theseus. Over time, as the wooden planks decayed, they were replaced one by one until none of the original material remained. The question arises, when every component has been substituted, does the ship remain the same object, or has it become something entirely new? This paradox examines how identity can persist through transformation and whether continuity of structure or substance defines what something is. The problem invites consideration of three possible sources of identity. It may reside in material composition, meaning that once all parts have been replaced, the ship is no longer the same. It may reside in form, where the arrangement and purpose of the object, rather than its material, maintain its identity. Or it may depend on continuity, suggesting that as long as the changes occur gradually and the process is recognized as continuous, the ship's identity endures. Each of these explanations captures part of the truth, yet fails to provide a complete resolution. The paradox remains because no single criterion of identity is sufficient in all cases. Philosophers have used this example to explore broader issues in metaphysics and personal identity. The human body, like the ship, undergoes constant renewal. Cells die and are replaced, memories fade, and personality evolves. Over a lifetime, nearly every physical and psychological component of a person changes. If identity depends on material sameness, the self cannot persist. If it depends on continuity of experience, then identity becomes a narrative rather than a substance, a record of change rather than a fixed entity. This view aligns with contemporary theories in psychology and neuroscience that describe the self as a dynamic process rather than an enduring object. The Ship of Theseus ultimately reveals the instability of the concept of sameness. It demonstrates that identity is not a single property, but a relation between time, memory, and perception. The ship, like the self, is a structure held together not by what it is made of, but by the story that connects its past and present forms. The question of whether it remains the same cannot be answered absolutely. It depends on what one means by same. In this way, the paradox continues to define the limits of understanding what it means to persist through change. The Grandfather Paradox. The Grandfather Paradox is one of the most recognized logical problems in the study of time travel and causation. It presents a scenario in which an individual travels into the past and performs an action that would prevent their own existence, such as stopping their grandparents from meeting. The paradox arises because if the act succeeds, the traveler would never be born, and therefore could not have traveled back to act in the first place. This contradiction exposes a deep conflict between the concept of free action and the structure of causality as it applies to time. In logical terms, the paradox demonstrates the incompatibility between backward causation and temporal consistency. The framework of classical physics assumes that causes precede effects in an unbroken, linear sequence. Once an effect occurs, it becomes part of the causal chain that determines the future. Time travel, however, introduces the possibility of retroactive influence, in which later events modify earlier ones. If such a modification is possible, the past is no longer fixed. But if the past can change, the coherence of the entire causal structure collapses, since the effect that initiates the change may erase the very conditions that allowed it to occur. This results in a logical loop with no stable outcome. Philosophers and physicists have approached this paradox in different ways. One response, often called the consistency principle, holds that any time travel event must be self-consistent. In this view, the traveler may go back in time, but their actions cannot alter established history. They can only fulfill it in ways already determined. Another approach introduces the concept of branching timelines or parallel universes. In such models, a traveler who changes the past does not rewrite their own history but creates a new, divergent sequence of events. Each line of reasoning attempts to preserve logical coherence, though neither eliminates the deeper conceptual difficulty of reconciling temporal direction with self-causation. The grandfather paradox ultimately raises questions beyond the mechanics of time travel. It challenges the assumption that time is a linear and independent medium through which events unfold. If cause and effect can reverse, time may be less a sequence than a structure shaped by observation and relation. The paradox remains unresolved because it touches on the foundations of both logic and physical reality, where the nature of time itself continues to resist full definition. The simulation hypothesis. The idea that reality might be a simulation belongs to a category of philosophical thought experiments that test the limits of perception and knowledge. It suggests that the physical world, including everything we observe and experience, could be the product of computational processes rather than an independently existing universe. The question is not simply whether technology could someday simulate reality, but whether it might already have done so. If a simulation could perfectly reproduce every aspect of experience, there would be no empirical way to distinguish it from the real world. The implication is unsettling because it undermines the assumption that direct experience guarantees truth. The roots of this idea reach back to philosophical skepticism. Thinkers such as Descartes questioned whether sensory experience could be trusted, imagining a world created by a deceiving force that manipulates perception. The simulation hypothesis extends that argument through the lens of technology. As computing power increases, it becomes theoretically possible to model entire environments, including the minds within them. A sufficiently advanced civilization could simulate conscious beings who believe they inhabit a physical universe. From this reasoning follows the proposition that if such simulations are possible and numerous, the probability of our living in one increases correspondingly. The problem is not technological, but epistemological. If perception is entirely mediated by the system in which one exists, no test from within the system can confirm or disprove its artificial nature. Every observation, every scientific measurement, would still occur inside the parameters of the simulation. The hypothesis thus resists falsification. Some physicists have attempted to approach it indirectly, examining whether the universe exhibits characteristics of digital structure, such as quantized space or computational limits, yet even these inquiries depend on interpreting evidence from within the same system they question. The implications of a simulated reality extend beyond physics or philosophy. If consciousness can emerge from digital processes, then reality may consist of nested layers of experience, each capable of generating the next. This leads to a recursive model of existence, where every level of reality could itself be a simulation of another. In such a framework, the distinction between real and artificial becomes meaningless. What remains is the continuity of perception and the persistence of awareness, regardless of the substrate in which it occurs. The question, then, is not whether we are simulated, but what it would change if we were. Zeno's Paradox. Zeno's paradox is one of the earliest recorded challenges to the coherence of motion and continuity. It originates from the 5th century BCE, when Zeno of Elea formulated a series of logical arguments intended to defend the philosophical position of his teacher, Parmenides, who held that reality is one, unchanging, and indivisible. Among these arguments, the most famous is often called the dichotomy paradox. It begins with a simple observation. Before reaching a destination, one must first reach the halfway point. Before reaching that halfway point, one must reach the halfway point of that distance, and so on without end. This reasoning leads to the conclusion that movement from one place to another requires completing an infinite number of steps, which seems impossible within any finite amount of time. The paradox depends on the assumption that space and time are infinitely divisible. If every interval, no matter how small, can be divided again, then motion involves traversing an unending sequence of smaller and smaller distances. Since completing an infinite sequence appears logically impossible, the very concept of motion seems incoherent. Yet motion undeniably occurs in the physical world, creating a contradiction between logical reasoning and direct observation. Zeno's argument does not deny that movement appears to happen. Rather, it challenges the rational foundation of how it could happen at all. Later thinkers have attempted to resolve the paradox through developments in mathematics and physics. The invention of calculus introduced the concept of limits, which allows infinite series to converge toward finite results. According to this framework, an infinite number of divisions can exist conceptually while still producing a measurable outcome, such as a finite distance or time interval. Modern physics further complicates the issue by suggesting that space and time may not be infinitely divisible after all, but quantized at extremely small scales. These solutions, however, do not eliminate the philosophical force of Zeno's argument. They address its mathematical expression, but not the deeper question of how continuous motion is experienced and understood. Zeno's paradox highlights the tension between abstraction and perception. Logic, when extended to its limits, can produce conclusions that conflict with lived experience. The human mind operates comfortably in both domains, but cannot fully reconcile them. The paradox endures as a reminder that even the simplest phenomena contain layers of complexity that logic alone cannot exhaust. Motion, taken for granted in everyday life, remains a problem at the foundations of thought. The first cause paradox. The first cause paradox concerns the problem of origins. It begins from the intuitive belief that every event or entity must have a cause. This principle underlies much of human reasoning and scientific inquiry. When applied to the universe as a whole, however, it leads to a question that reason cannot easily answer. If everything that exists must have a cause, then what caused the first thing? The paradox arises because both possible responses lead to difficulty. To claim that the chain of causes extends infinitely backward creates the problem of infinite regression, in which no ultimate foundation for existence can ever be reached. To claim instead that there was a first cause that itself was uncaused introduces something that exists outside the very rule it was meant to explain. Philosophers have approached this issue in various ways. In classical metaphysics, the idea of a prime mover or unmoved mover, proposed by Aristotle, served as a logical resolution. He argued that there must be an initial source of motion that itself is not moved by anything else, otherwise motion could not exist at all. Later theological interpretations identified this first cause with the concept of God, an eternal and necessary being that does not depend on anything prior. In contrast, modern scientific perspectives have replaced divine necessity with natural explanation. The Big Bang Theory, for example, describes the observable universe as expanding from an initial singularity, but it does not account for why that singularity existed or what preceded it. The paradox, therefore, remains even when expressed in physical rather than theological terms. Attempts to remove the paradox often redefine the concept of causation itself. Some philosophers argue that causality applies only within the universe and cannot be meaningfully extended to the universe as a whole. Others suggest that the question of an origin may be meaningless, since time itself may have begun with the universe, and thus there was never a before in which a cause could occur. Still others propose that existence is self-sustaining, requiring no external cause. Each of these interpretations acknowledges that the limits of human understanding may prevent any definitive answer. The first cause paradox ultimately exposes the boundary between explanation and mystery. It reminds us that all reasoning begins from premises that cannot be proven from within the system they describe. Whether the origin of everything is a divine act, a spontaneous quantum event, or an inherent property of existence itself, it remains a point where thought reaches its limit. The paradox persists because the very idea of a beginning resists complete comprehension. The liar's paradox. The liar's paradox is one of the simplest yet most challenging problems in logic and philosophy of language. It is expressed in a sentence that refers to itself, such as, "This sentence is false." If the statement is true, then it must be false, because it claims falsity. But if it is false, then it must be true, because it correctly asserts that it is false. The paradox emerges from this loop. in which the statement alternates endlessly between truth and falsehood without settling on either. Although the example appears trivial, it exposes a fundamental instability in systems that attempt to describe truth through self-reference. The paradox has been known since antiquity, attributed to the Greek philosopher Epimenides, who declared that all Cretans are liars, while being a Cretan himself. Later logicians refined this idea into the self-referential version that now defines the liar's paradox. It has since played a major role in the study of semantics, mathematics, and formal logic. The problem is not limited to clever wordplay. It challenges the very foundation of how truth is defined. In classical logic, every proposition must be either true or false, but not both. The liar's paradox demonstrates that some statements cannot be consistently classified within this binary structure, suggesting that the system itself is incomplete. Philosophers and mathematicians have proposed different ways to handle this inconsistency. One approach is to deny that self-referential statements like, "this sentence is false," have a truth value at all, treating them as meaningless or undefined. Another response involves developing alternative logical frameworks, such as three-valued or par-consistent logics, where a statement can be both true and false simultaneously without collapsing the system. The paradox also influenced Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which showed that any sufficiently powerful formal system contains statements that cannot be proven true or false within that system. In this way, the liar's paradox serves as both a linguistic puzzle and a window into the structural limits of logic. Language depends on the assumption that words can reliably represent truth, yet the paradox reveals how easily this assumption can fail. When a statement refers to itself, meaning becomes circular and self-consuming. The liar's paradox illustrates that truth is not always a stable property, but a relation defined by the system in which it is expressed. It shows that attempts to describe truth in absolute terms inevitably encounter boundaries imposed by self-reference. What seems at first a small contradiction in wording becomes a reflection of the deeper problem of whether truth can ever fully contain itself. The paradox of the self. The paradox of the self addresses one of the most persistent questions in philosophy and psychology. What does it mean to be a self? The statement, "I am," seems obvious and direct, yet on closer examination, it reveals uncertainty. When a person refers to I, they point to something that appears constant throughout experience, but its nature is difficult to define. The body changes, thoughts evolve, and memories fade, yet there remains a sense of continuity that feels unified. The paradox arises from the tension between this apparent permanence and the observable fact that everything composing a person is in continuous transformation. In Western philosophy, the search for the self has often been framed as the search for an enduring substance or essence. Thinkers such as Descartes identified the self with a capacity for thought, proposing that consciousness itself is the fundamental reality. Later philosophers questioned this certainty, arguing that what we call self may be an aggregation of mental events rather than a single entity. Empiricists like David Hume concluded that introspection reveals only a series of perceptions, not a unified observer behind them. In this view, the self is not a thing but a pattern, a continuity created by memory and association rather than by substance. In Eastern traditions, particularly within Buddhism, a similar conclusion is reached through different reasoning. The doctrine of anatta, or no-self, holds that the belief in a permanent identity is a form of ignorance that sustains suffering. According to this perspective, what appears as I is a temporary arrangement of physical and mental processes, form, sensation, perception, intention, and consciousness, none of which endure independently. The illusion of self arises when these transient components are mistaken for a unified whole. Recognizing the absence of a fixed identity does not negate existence, but reframes it as a continuous flow rather than a static object. Modern cognitive science and neuroscience lend support to aspects of these older insights. The brain constructs a sense of self through processes of integration and prediction, binding sensations, memories, and goals into a coherent model of agency. Yet this model is functional rather than absolute. It allows coordination and survival, but does not prove the existence of a separate entity behind experience. The paradox of the self, therefore, reflects the gap between how consciousness feels and how it operates. If identity is a process rather than an object, then the individual is not a permanent being but an ongoing event, a stream of awareness that, for practical purposes, imagines itself as a stable point within time. The twin paradox. The twin paradox is a thought experiment derived from Albert Einstein's theory of special relativity. It describes a situation in which two identical twins begin at the same point in time and space. One remains on Earth, while the other travels into space at a velocity close to the speed of light. Upon returning, the traveling twin discovers that less time has passed for them than for their sibling who stayed behind. The traveler has aged more slowly. At first glance, this outcome appears contradictory because each twin could claim that the other was in motion, yet only one experiences the time difference. The paradox lies in understanding how both perspectives can be true within the framework of relativity. Einstein's theory holds that the passage of time is not absolute, but depends on the observer's frame of reference. Time and space are part of a single continuum known as spacetime, and the measurement of time intervals varies according to relative motion. The faster an object moves, the slower time slows for it relative to an observer at rest. This effect, known as time dilation, has been experimentally verified through precise measurements involving atomic clocks and high-speed particles. In the case of the twins, the traveling twin undergoes acceleration and deceleration during the journey, which breaks the symmetry between their experiences. Because one twin changes inertial frames while the other does not, the result is consistent with the predictions of relativity rather than an actual contradiction. The twin paradox illustrates that time is not an independent background in which events unfold, but a dynamic quantity shaped by motion and gravity. It also demonstrates the limitations of intuition in understanding physical reality. Everyday experience suggests that time flows uniformly for all observers, yet at high velocities or in strong gravitational fields, this assumption fails. The paradox invites reflection on the nature of simultaneity. Two events that appear to occur at the same time in one frame of reference may occur at different times in another. The implications extend beyond theoretical physics. The thought experiment challenges the notion of a universal present and suggests that reality is composed of overlapping perspectives, each internally consistent but relative to its frame of observation. In this sense, the twin paradox reveals that time is not merely a measure of change, but a property woven into the structure of existence itself, elastic, conditional, and inseparable from the motion through which it is perceived. The Omnipotence Paradox. The Omnipotence Paradox addresses a logical problem concerning the concept of unlimited power. It is most often expressed in the form of a question: can an all-powerful being create a stone so heavy that it cannot lift it? If the being can create such a stone, then there is something it cannot do, namely lift it. If it cannot create the stone, then there is also something it cannot do, namely create it. In either case, the notion of absolute power appears to collapse into contradiction. The paradox is not primarily theological but philosophical, concerning the coherence of the idea of boundless capability within the constraints of logic. Philosophers have long debated whether the concept of omnipotence can be meaningfully defined. If power is understood as the ability to bring about any possible state of affairs, then the paradox exposes a problem in defining what counts as possible. Some responses propose that omnipotence does not include the ability to do what is logically impossible. Creating a square circle or a stone that an omnipotent being cannot lift would fall into this category, as these are contradictions in terms. In this interpretation, omnipotence is not the power to violate logic, but the possession of every power that can exist coherently. Others argue that this limitation weakens the very definition of omnipotence, reducing it to something less than absolute. The paradox also invites reflection on the relationship between power and self-limitation. If omnipotence includes the ability to restrict itself, then a being could, in theory, choose to create conditions it cannot overcome, not because it lacks power, but because it exercises power in self-constraint. This interpretation reframes omnipotence as the capacity to determine even its own boundaries. However, such reasoning still depends on how one interprets logical consistency. If logic itself is a product of the being's will, then the paradox may dissolve. If logic exists independently, then omnipotence is limited by the very structure of reason. Beyond theology, the Omnipotence Paradox highlights a general problem in systems of absolute description. Any concept defined without limitation risks negating itself, because a definition requires distinction. To describe something as all-powerful, all-knowing, or infinite is to assign it attributes that inevitably encounter self-reference. The paradox thus illustrates that even the idea of perfection contains internal constraints. Whether applied to divinity, nature, or thought, it suggests that the notion of total power is inseparable from the logic that both defines and restricts it. The Infinite Hotel. The Infinite Hotel, also known as Hilbert's Hotel, is a thought experiment conceived by the German mathematician David Hilbert in the early 20th century to illustrate the counterintuitive nature of infinity. The scenario begins with a hotel that contains an infinite number of rooms, all of which are occupied. In an ordinary context, this would mean that no additional guests could be accommodated. However, in an infinite hotel, the manager can still make room for new arrivals. By asking each guest to move from room 1 to room 2, from room 2 to room 3, and so on without end, the first room becomes vacant while every other guest retains a place. Despite being full, the hotel expands its occupancy without limit. This thought experiment captures one of the most distinctive properties of infinite sets, the capacity to remain unchanged even after addition or subtraction. In conventional arithmetic, adding one unit to a finite quantity produces a new, larger number. With infinity, this rule no longer applies. An infinite set is equivalent to a subset of itself, meaning that infinity is not a number in the usual sense, but a concept describing an unbounded process. Hilbert's Hotel demonstrates this through concrete imagery, translating an abstract mathematical principle into an example that reveals how human intuition struggles with infinite magnitude. The paradoxical behavior of infinity has significant implications in mathematics, philosophy, and cosmology. In mathematics, it distinguishes between different sizes or orders of infinity, such as countable and uncountable infinities. In philosophy, it raises questions about the coherence of actual infinity as opposed to potential infinity, the difference between an infinite process that can continue without end and an infinite quantity that exists all at once. In cosmology, the idea of an infinite universe evokes similar challenges. If space has no boundary, what does it mean for it to expand? Hilbert's Hotel also serves as a metaphor for the mind's confrontation with the unbounded. Infinity resists containment by reason, yet it can be represented and manipulated through formal systems. This tension between comprehension and impossibility parallels the limits of consciousness itself, which can conceive of infinity but cannot experience it directly. The Infinite Hotel reveals that the infinite is not merely a mathematical abstraction but a reflection of the limits of human understanding. It is both familiar and unreachable, a concept that expands endlessly within the finite boundaries of thought. The Bootstrap Paradox. The Bootstrap Paradox presents a logical problem involving time travel and the nature of causation. It describes a scenario in which an object, idea, or piece of information is brought back in time and becomes its source itself. A common example is that of a scientist who travels to the past and gives her younger self the plans for an invention that she later builds. When she grows older, she again travels back in time to deliver the same plans. The paradox arises because there is no clear point of origin. The plans seem to exist in a closed causal loop, having never been created by anyone. They simply exist, passed endlessly from one point in time to another. This paradox illustrates the problem of self-causation, in which an effect becomes its own cause. In ordinary logic, causality operates in one direction. A cause precedes an effect, and each event is part of a larger chain extending backward and forward through time. The Bootstrap Paradox disrupts this order by removing the initial cause altogether. The result is a temporal loop in which the sequence of events remains consistent but lacks an external explanation. This challenges not only the laws of physics but also the conceptual foundations of origin and authorship. If something can exist without ever being created, the distinction between cause and effect collapses. In theoretical physics, the paradox is often discussed in relation to closed time-like curves, hypothetical paths in space-time that allow an object to return to its own past. General relativity permits such structures under certain conditions, though their physical plausibility remains debated. From a philosophical perspective, the paradox raises questions about determinism and the nature of explanation. If every event in the loop is consistent with the others, then the system as a whole may be self-contained and logically coherent, even if it lacks an identifiable beginning. The paradox, therefore, may not indicate a contradiction, but rather a limit in how human reasoning interprets temporal order. The implications of the Bootstrap Paradox extend beyond time travel. It touches on the problem of creation itself. Many systems of thought, from cosmology to philosophy of mind, rely on identifying an initial source or first cause. The Bootstrap model suggests an alternative, that certain structures might exist without origin, sustained entirely by their own continuity. In such a view, existence becomes self-referential, and creation is not an event but a loop, a process that begins nowhere yet persists indefinitely. Schrödinger's cat. Schrödinger's cat is one of the most well-known thought experiments in the history of modern physics. It was proposed in 1935 by the Austrian physicist Erwin Schrödinger as a way to illustrate the conceptual difficulties of quantum mechanics when applied to everyday objects. The scenario imagines a cat placed inside a sealed box along with a radioactive atom, a Geiger counter, and a vial of poison. If the atom decays, the Geiger counter triggers a mechanism that releases the poison, killing the cat. If the atom does not decay, the cat remains alive. According to the principles of quantum theory, until the system is observed, the atom exists in a superposition of decayed and undecayed states. Consequently, the cat must also be considered both alive and dead at the same time, a situation that defies common sense. The paradox arises from the gap between quantum behavior and classical observation. At the subatomic level, particles do not have definite properties until they are measured. Instead, they exist in a range of probabilities. Schrödinger designed his thought experiment to criticize the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, which holds that physical systems remain in superposition until observation causes them to collapse into a single outcome. The cat-in-the-box scenario exposes the absurdity of extending this interpretation to macroscopic objects, where the idea of something being simultaneously alive and dead seems logically incoherent. It forces the question of where, if anywhere, the boundary between quantum uncertainty and classical certainty lies. Subsequent developments in physics and philosophy have not resolved the issue, but have reframed it. Some interpretations, such as the many worlds hypothesis, propose that every possible outcome of a quantum event actually occurs in a separate, branching universe. In this view, the cat is alive in one branch and dead in another, and observation merely reveals which branch the observer occupies. Other approaches attempt to explain the apparent collapse of the wave function through interactions with the environment rather than conscious observation. Each interpretation reflects a different attempt to reconcile the mathematics of quantum theory with the experience of a stable world. The implications of Schrödinger's cat extend beyond physics. The experiment challenges assumptions about reality, observation, and knowledge. It suggests that the act of observation is not a passive recording of facts, but an active participation in the structure of the world. Whether or not consciousness plays a direct role in determining outcomes, the thought experiment reveals an intimate relationship between the observer and the observed. It stands as a reminder that reality, at its most fundamental level, resists complete separation from the process by which it is known. The paradox of tolerance. The paradox of tolerance concerns the limits of freedom within a social and political system. It was formulated by the philosopher Karl Popper in his 1945 work, The Open Society and Its Enemies, as a warning about the dangers of absolute tolerance. The paradox arises when a society committed to tolerance is confronted by intolerant forces that exploit that very openness to undermine or abolish it. If tolerance is extended without restriction, it allows intolerance to grow unchecked until tolerance itself is destroyed. In this sense, The paradox exposes a contradiction within the idea of unlimited liberty. To preserve a tolerant society, some degree of intolerance toward intolerance may be necessary. Popper's argument is not merely theoretical. History provides numerous examples of democratic or open societies that collapsed because they permitted groups hostile to freedom to use democratic rights for anti-democratic purposes. The paradox, therefore, raises a moral and practical question. At what point does the defense of tolerance require limiting the freedoms of those who would destroy it? If every viewpoint is permitted equal legitimacy, even those advocating the suppression of others, tolerance ceases to function as a safeguard of diversity and becomes a mechanism of its own undoing. The challenge lies in distinguishing between the protection of open discourse and the protection of those who would end it. The problem extends beyond politics into broader ethical and cultural contexts. It applies to debates about free speech, pluralism, and the responsibilities of individuals in maintaining civil society. A system that values freedom of expression must determine whether that freedom includes the right to promote harm, exclusion, or violence. If it does, tolerance loses its capacity to sustain justice. Yet if it restricts dissent too broadly, it risks becoming authoritarian under the guise of self-preservation. This balance defines one of the central tensions of modern liberal thought: how to uphold the principles of openness without enabling their destruction. The paradox of tolerance thus reveals that tolerance is not a passive condition but an active practice. It requires discernment, restraint, and sometimes intervention. A society that values peace must recognize that peace cannot exist without boundaries that protect it. Popper's insight remains relevant because it identifies a recurring dynamic in human systems: the necessity of limiting certain freedoms to preserve the broader framework that allows freedom to exist at all. The paradox of silence. The paradox of silence examines the relationship between absence and perception. Silence is typically understood as the lack of sound, yet the very act of recognizing silence depends on the awareness of sound. One cannot perceive the absence of noise without first knowing what noise is. This makes silence not a condition that exists independently, but a relative phenomenon that acquires meaning only through contrast. The question of whether true silence can exist, therefore, leads to a deeper inquiry into perception itself. If there were no listener to notice it, could silence even be said to exist? In physical terms, perfect silence would require the complete absence of vibration, since sound arises from the movement of particles through a medium such as air. In practice, such conditions are nearly impossible to achieve outside of artificial environments. Even in an anechoic chamber, where external noise is eliminated, the listener still hears the internal sounds of their own body, the heartbeat, the movement of blood, and the hum of the nervous system. This suggests that silence cannot be experienced as a total void. The moment one becomes aware of silence, it is already broken by the presence of one's own perception. The paradox lies in the fact that silence, as an absolute state, cannot coexist with the awareness that defines it. Philosophically, silence also carries implications beyond acoustics. It can signify emptiness, contemplation, or restraint. In communication, silence may convey meaning as effectively as speech, serving as both presence and absence. Yet even here, it functions only in relation to what surrounds it. A pause in conversation, for example, gains significance because it occurs within the flow of words. Silence outside of any such context would not register as silence at all, but as non-existence. The human mind frames meaning through contrast, and silence provides one of the most fundamental contrasts to sound, expression, and thought. The paradox of silence, therefore, exposes the interdependence between perception and existence. Absolute silence is unobservable, not because it cannot exist in theory, but because its existence would negate the possibility of awareness. To hear nothing is, paradoxically, to encounter the act of hearing itself. In this sense, silence is not an empty state, but a mirror reflecting the listener's own consciousness. It reminds us that perception is not separate from what it perceives, and that even in stillness, awareness continues to generate its own subtle sound. The Hedonism Paradox. The Hedonism Paradox refers to the observation that the direct pursuit of pleasure or happiness often results in the opposite effect. It describes a psychological phenomenon in which the more a person consciously strives to feel happy, the less likely they are to achieve that state. Instead of satisfaction, the deliberate pursuit of pleasure can lead to dissatisfaction, anxiety, or a sense of emptiness. This paradox challenges the assumption that happiness is best attained through active seeking, suggesting instead that it arises indirectly as a byproduct of other pursuits or conditions. The paradox has roots in both philosophical and psychological thought. In philosophy, it is associated with the idea that pleasure cannot be the ultimate aim of life because it is inherently self-defeating when pursued as an end in itself. Thinkers such as John Stuart Mill argued that happiness is achieved not by aiming directly at it, but by engaging in meaningful activities that produce it as a consequence. Similarly, in modern psychology, studies of well-being indicate that people who fixate on personal happiness tend to report lower levels of life satisfaction. The reason lies in the cognitive mechanisms of self-reflection and expectation. When individuals constantly monitor their emotional state and evaluate whether they are happy, they shift attention away from the experiences that naturally generate positive feelings. This paradox can also be understood in terms of motivation. Pleasure functions as feedback rather than as a goal. It signals the fulfillment of needs, the successful resolution of challenges, or engagement in intrinsically rewarding activities. When the pursuit of pleasure becomes the primary objective, it detaches from these underlying conditions, losing the very structure that gives it coherence. The result is often a cycle of seeking stimulation without contentment, where the effort to feel good heightens awareness of dissatisfaction. The act of striving becomes self-defeating because it transforms happiness into a task rather than a state of being. The implications of the hedonism paradox extend to ethics and human behavior. It suggests that happiness is not something one can command, but something that emerges from alignment between intention, action, and context. Like sleep, which occurs only when one ceases trying to force it, happiness tends to appear when attention is directed elsewhere, toward learning, creation, or connection. The paradox thus reframes happiness as a consequence of engagement rather than a commodity to be obtained. It implies that fulfillment is not found in the pursuit of pleasure itself, but in the quiet coherence that follows when action and purpose coincide. The Epistemic Paradox. The Epistemic Paradox concerns the problem of how knowledge can justify itself. It begins with a simple question: can you truly know that you know anything? This question lies at the core of epistemology, the branch of philosophy that studies the nature and limits of knowledge. To know something is commonly understood as holding a belief that is both true and justified. However, this definition leads to difficulty when the justification itself is questioned. Every reason for believing something depends on other reasons, forming an unending chain of justification that can never reach a final, unquestionable foundation. The paradox arises because if knowledge requires complete certainty, then no belief can fully satisfy that condition. Philosophers since antiquity have grappled with this problem. The ancient skeptics argued that because every claim to knowledge depends on assumptions that themselves require proof, true certainty is unattainable. Descartes attempted to resolve this by seeking a foundation immune to doubt, concluding that the act of doubting proved the existence of the doubter. Yet even this, I think, therefore I am, leaves open questions about the reliability of perception, memory, and reason. Later thinkers expanded on this problem, showing that any attempt to justify knowledge either leads to infinite regress, circular reasoning, or arbitrary assumption. These outcomes, sometimes referred to as the trilemma of Agrippa, demonstrate the structural limits of rational justification. In modern philosophy, the problem persists in different forms. Foundationalist theories attempt to ground knowledge in basic self-evident truths, while coherentist theories argue that beliefs are justified by their consistency within a system rather than by appeal to a single foundation. Both approaches, however, leave unresolved the question of how such systems connect to reality itself. The epistemic paradox, therefore, remains active not because it admits no solution, but because it reveals the boundary between confidence and certainty, between knowing and believing. The implications extend beyond abstract philosophy. In daily life, people act on knowledge that is always provisional, shaped by perception, interpretation, and context. This does not render knowledge meaningless, but situates it within uncertainty. The paradox reminds us that all understanding is mediated through perspective and that awareness cannot step outside itself to confirm its own accuracy. Knowledge, in this sense, is suspended over mystery. It reflects the world as a mirror reflects a face, clearly, yet without ever seeing its own image. The Nothing Paradox. The Nothing Paradox explores the problem of defining absolute non-existence. It begins from a simple yet confounding question: what does it mean for nothing to exist? The moment one tries to conceive of nothing, it becomes something, a concept, an image, or a state. To speak or think of nothing already transforms it into an object of awareness, thereby contradicting its intended meaning. This paradox reveals a limitation not only of language, but of cognition itself. The mind is structured to think in terms of presence, relation, and differentiation. When it attempts to imagine complete absence, it must still use the tools of representation, which inevitably produce something rather than nothing. Philosophers throughout history have confronted this problem without resolution. In ancient thought, Parmenides argued that nothing could not exist, since to speak of it as existing in any form would affirm its being. For him, only what could truly be said to exist. Non-being was incoherent. Later thinkers challenged this strict division, treating nothingness as an essential concept for understanding change, creation, and negation. In existential philosophy, figures such as Heidegger and Sartre explored nothingness not as a void separate from being, but as a condition that makes awareness possible. The capacity to perceive absence, to notice what is not, forms part of what it means to exist as a conscious being. In this sense, nothing is not the opposite of being, but one of its boundaries. In physics, the problem persists under a different guise. The vacuum of space, once thought to be empty, is now understood to contain fields, fluctuations, and virtual particles that appear and vanish continuously. Even when stripped of matter and radiation, space is never truly nothing. It possesses structure, energy, and potential. Quantum theory suggests that what appears to be emptiness is in fact a dynamic field capable of giving rise to particles and forces. Thus, even at the most fundamental level, absolute nothingness eludes definition. Every attempt to identify it reveals the persistence of something, energy, form, or possibility. The Nothing Paradox, therefore, exposes a fundamental tension between thought and absence. Nothing can be conceived without transforming into something, and even the physical void resists complete erasure. Rather than an empty negation, nothingness may be understood as the background condition from which existence emerges, the silent counterpart that allows presence to appear. In this view, the void is not mere absence, but the origin of potential, the unseen foundation upon which everything rests. The Paradox of Awakening. The Paradox of Awakening examines the tension between the experience of enlightenment and the structure of perception itself. It begins with the question of whether one can truly awaken from illusion if the observer and what is observed are not separate. In most traditions of thought, awakening or enlightenment is described as a transition from ignorance to understanding, from delusion to clarity. Yet this idea presupposes a distinction between the one who awakens and the condition from which awakening occurs. If consciousness is both the dreamer and the dream, this distinction cannot hold. The paradox arises because the very act of seeking to awaken reinforces the illusion of separation that awakening is meant to dissolve. In philosophical and spiritual contexts, this paradox has appeared under different names. In Western philosophy, it echoes the problem of self-reference found in epistemology, where the mind attempts to grasp itself as an object of knowledge. In Eastern philosophy, particularly within certain schools of Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta, it is expressed as the realization that there is no individual self to attain enlightenment, Awareness itself is already the state that is sought. From this perspective, the process of seeking enlightenment is like a wave searching for the ocean. It cannot find what it already is. The illusion lies not in ignorance of truth, but in the assumption that truth is something external to be acquired. The paradox of awakening, therefore, concerns the limits of dualistic thought. To wake up implies movement from one state to another, but if reality is a continuous whole, there can be no transition between illusion and truth. What appears as awakening is instead a shift in recognition, a dissolution of the distinction between the seeker and the sought. In this view, enlightenment is not an achievement, but the recognition that there was never anything to achieve. The paradox resolves itself not through explanation, but through the quiet understanding that awareness and existence are inseparable. What remains after this realization is not revelation in the usual sense, but simplicity. There is no outside to reality, no detached observer, and no final boundary between dream and wakefulness. The paradox dissolves in the act of seeing that there was never a division to begin with. In that dissolution, what persists is stillness, a state neither asleep nor awake, but entirely present. The journey ends where it began, in the awareness that has always been here. Take one last deep breath. The impossible has unfolded, and yet you remain, suspended between knowing and dreaming, in the quiet place where paradoxes live.